Howdy.
Hi, happy Friday.
Yeah, same to you.
How are you?
Not bad. Uh, on the verge of being exhausted, but not there yet.
Yeah, that's how I feel every day. That's standard.
Yeah. Yeah.
How was your early bird presentation, Brian, at the Berlaga?
It was good. It was it was nice and successful. I guess I was on a big screen in a room with like 30 or 40 people all looking at the big screen. So hopefully at that high of a resolution, they're not seeing too much of my imperfections.
And the audience
But-
was interested in US issues or history?
Seemed like it. I think most of the questions in general were much like broader. They weren't very specific to all of what I was working on, but it was still a nice conversation. I don't know what the Berlaga's program is exactly. It's a master's program, but it's like a non-professional master's program, but all the questions seem to be coming kind of in the spirit of like, we're going to be practicing architects. So that's why we want to think about these questions in the present. So I don't know a lot about it actually.
Well, it's definitely getting to be that real point in the semester where I can feel the student burnout through the screens. How are you all doing?
Am I emanating burnout through the screen?
No, not you, but some.
Certainly that's how I feel though, nonetheless.
Yeah.
Yes, we're all there. We certainly see that in the students.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell they're kind of at their limits at this point.
I feel like everyone was at that point last year, and then nobody got a break and
Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely not the easiest semester.
Yeah. I have this blissed out puppy on my lap right now.
Oh, that's nice.
Hey, Sarah. So, Brian, Nerea from the board is supposed to be the one joining to introduce the three of you.
Okay.
I don't see her yet, but if I don't see her, I will read your bios.
Okay. Yeah, whatever is easy.
Yeah.
I just kind of assumed we're at a rough point in the semester, so we'll see who's here, and it'll be a casual.
I never assume that,
conversation.
and then we get here and I go, oh, right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you're okay with it, we'll wait till a few minutes after 12, and then there's Sarah, other Sarah.
Yeah, that's completely fine with me. Whatever is best for you.
Hey, Sarah Lopez. Nice to see you. Is this your Washington office, Sarah?
Hello, all. Hello,
Hey,
Brian, Sarah, Alex, Barbara, Leora,
Hey,
Irina.
America.
Hello.
Hi, America. Hi, Sarah.
Yeah, Leora, it is.
Sarah,
Hi.
are you surviving Dumbarton Oaks?
Indeed. I have an empty bookcase behind me.
Oh, empty.
Yeah, look.
Wow.
I know I just moved into this other office and I haven't made it my own yet.
Where is it? It's one of the offices in the library.
Yeah.
I recognize.
Hi, Maria.
Hello,
Hey, Fernando.
Maria.
Thanks.
Fernando.
Hello, everybody.
I think we're gonna give it like 2 more minutes and then begin. Nerea, do you need anything else for the intro or anything? I think I sent you bio stuff. Okay.
Yeah, I got what you sent me. Thanks. Hi, everybody.
There are two of us watching.
Oh, I have one too.
Very good.
If only I could nap through the day like they do.
Oh, I know. They're blessed.
Hi, Michael. So I think in spring, we're going to try this back in the seminar room, see how it goes. I'm looking forward to it.
Wow.
Yeah,
Do you think people will be masked?
I hope so. I think we'll have to see how it goes, but it sure would be nice. Nerea, if you want to get started, I think we have also a small group on YouTube. We can take it away if y'all are ready.
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody to today's lunch forum. I know it's a busy time in the semester. It's great to see you, and especially thank you, Brian, for making time for this. We're really excited to hear you speak. So I'm just going to be introducing briefly Brian Norwood and his presentation today, Contracts and Architectural Visions, Notes from the Long 19th Century's Archives. Brian Norwood is an architectural historian and assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on architecture and building practices in the United States and Atlantic world in the long 19th century. He's working on 2 book-length projects, the first entitled Architectural Calling, Protestantism, Nationalism, and Racecraft in the Formation of a U.S. Profession, which focuses on the Atlantic coast of the US in the 1830s and 60s. And the second is a study of architecture's role in shaping the intersection of industrialization and historical consciousness in the American South between Reconstruction and the New Deal. And then also today, we're lucky to have with us Bárbara Cortizo de Aguiar and Alexander Bala, which are gonna establish a dialogue with Brian after his presentation. So Bárbara Cortizo de Aguiar is a PhD candidate in architecture and architectural history and a preservation architect. And Barbara's interests are nationalism, cultural identity, and architectural history in the Americans. And in her doctoral research, Barbara discusses the role of the built environment in national identity creation and nation building processes, studying the establishment of the National Heritage Institutes of Brazil, Mexico, and the United States in the early 1900s. Barbara analyzes how those agencies were partially responsible for crafting the country's national identity by perpetuating a mostly white side of their history. And then with us today also we have Alexander Bala, who is also a PhD candidate at the architecture school here with us. And he received a bachelor's from Virginia Tech, a master's in architectural history from UT and was a Fulbright scholar in Poland during 2018-19 academic year. His research centers around Polish modernism and specifically focuses on the post-war architect, designer, and artist Oskar Hansen, and his theory of the open form, which advocates for the role of architecture and the design of the built environment as a participant-based, mutable backdrop that drives foreground effects and facilitates social relationships between individuals and their collective organizations. Thank you, the three of you, for participating today. And with this, I'm going to turn things over to Brian. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here and get rolling. All right, we good? Everybody see the slides and hear me okay? Excellent. So I think I first want to start off by thanking everybody for taking the time out of your day to be here at the very busy part of the semester. And thanks to Leora and Sarah and Barbara and Alex and everybody for participating in this. And I should also say thank you for the chance to become part of this academic and intellectual community. So what I'm going to use this talk to do is just talk through some stuff that I'm working on right now, and try to give a little bit of an overview of where my thought is on a couple of things, and hopefully actually use this to get y'all to help me think through stuff that I'm doing. Since most people here we've talked about some stuff before. So let me begin with a brief narratival hook. What you see here are the conditions for an 1846 building contract in which every instance of the architect is crossed through. It's a contract written up by the New York architect Alexander Jackson Davis using a fill-in-the-blank legal document he developed and used in the 1840s. In this case, Davis crossed himself out of the contract that he created. The contract from which Davis excised himself was for the construction of a 4-story house that he designed for a wealthy client named Charles A. Davis, to whom he had no relation, in Gramercy Park in New York. He combined a set of drawings with specifications to communicate his design. In writing the specifications to go along with his drawings of the house, Davis used his standard 12-page fill-in-the-blank document to describe all the labor required of excavators, masons, plasterers, carpenters, plumbers, painters, and so on the house. He then used this set of drawings and specification to get a series of bids on the project from carpenters and masons. And whoever won this bidding competition was going to act as the general contractor for the whole project. So from the 7 bids he got, Davis selected the stonemasons, HV and DC Weeks, to perform the work. Davis then drafted an agreement between the client and the Weeks brothers, an agreement from which he removed himself as an active agent. So it's worth noting all the authority that Davis gave himself in the standardized contract he had created, authority that he then gave up in this case by going back and crossing himself out. So he'd given himself authority in judging construction work in progress as satisfactory, providing further explanation of the drawings, having unsatisfactory work undone and removed, charging the contractor for failing to perform, expensing the contractor for work the architect hired out directly because the contractor failed to perform, making changes to drawings and specs as necessary, in many different ways having binding and conclusive say on all matters related to the project, adjusting the building delivery schedule, controlling distributions of payments, and finally balancing the total bill. So Davis designed a building and then handed it off to others to construct. In a contract for a house like this, where Davis is striking himself out, he was doing something that was very common for professional architects in the early 19th century in the US, even as they described this as a deficient form of practice. So in a period of about 8 months, he made $133 from doing these drawings and writing the specification. So this is from his diary. You may have noticed in that previous slide that the building contract was for $7,700. So Davis's total bill for the design was for about 1.7% of the construction costs, hardly what architects like him were arguing they should get paid. So the Charles Davis House was a case of an architect not doing what professional architects said they should be doing, controlling construction administration and billing at 5% of total construction costs. However, architects not holding to the putative professional ideals that they set for themselves, this was not an uncommon thing. But I begin with this story just to get a much broader question. What is a profession that shapes a position of authority and then puts itself under erasure in the self-authored document outlining that very authority? That is, what creates a profession that wants to be both in and not in the messiness of the world? So I've published some small pieces on this project over the last couple of years already, but by and large, it's a book manuscript that I'm hoping is about a year away from being done. The arc of the manuscript winds its way through the Atlantic coast kind of architectural practices from the 1830s to 1860s, tying together conceptions of design, the use of contract, public lectures on architecture, and grand historical visions that craft narratives about race and religious eschatology. My goal is to imbricate architecture as a practice within the histories of capitalism, racecraft, religion, and nationalism. I'm attending in particular to the way the formations of market capitalism, racial and religious discourse, and white Protestant nationalism intersected with the professionalizing ambitions of architects. So I find these two images from the 1840s and 50s particularly useful in framing the scope and purpose of this argument. So in William Wilson's frontispiece for the American carpenter turned self-declared architect, Edward Shaw's 1854 book, The Modern Architect, we see the architect sitting, using his drafting tools to mediate between builders' labor and the client's desires and money. In this image, the architect is figured as a kind of intermediary, a neutral voice of reason protecting both the client and the builder. But in Thomas Cole's 1841 painting, The Architect's Dream, a painting done at the request of the architect Ithiel Town, the architect lounges on top of a column with his books and drawings, gazing back through the deep historical plot guiding his noble profession while he holds a drawing forward towards the future. In this image, the architect is presented as a civilized figure, one who sits almost outside of history, using the whole of the past in order to act in the present. Between these two postures, the sitting architect who draws and the lounging architect who gazes back, a kind of unresolved identity crisis was formed. The architect is the master of world historical ideas and aesthetics and morals, and the architect is a neutral mediator, a protector of both parties in a market-based exchange. It's the collision of these two identities that interests me in this project. So in trying to describe the nature of their role, 19th century US architects often pointed to lawyers as the quintessential example of the kind of professionalism to which they aspired. The lawyer is a disinterested gentleman whose mediatory work pursued the higher ideals of justice, provided a picture of mediation with an elevated goal. But in a nutshell, I'm arguing in this book in progress that if we are really going to understand the vicissitudes of professional architecture under market capitalism, we actually need to interpret the profession in light of the Protestant ministry, a profession to which architects were in fact more proximate. These proximities took shape through the way architects talked about the importance and necessity of the work, and in particular, how architects framed their work as a moral tool in bending a divine historical arc. Thus, in the collision of the identities of the architect as a keeper of history and the architect as a mediator, we actually see a piece of the formation of a kind of American civil religion, one in which confidence in the market is confidence in society as such. So a particular tension in the vision of the profession that took place in the early 19th century was over the relation of ideational design and material realization. For architects, this looked kind of like an unintegrated mixture of absolute faith in their power and a kind of resolute disappointment in their limits. To crib from Manfredo Tafuri, early Republican architects often saw themselves as angels with dirty hands. They were practitioners looking towards heaven, but whose work was sullied by the material world. So one of my main arguments in this book, as I already mentioned, is that the nature of architecture was shaped by the tension between two approaches to design, one that saw architectural work as ideational, as something that connected the earth to heavenly impulses, and one that saw it as a work of earthly mediation. In its ideational sense, the design scope was that of history itself. But in its contractual sense, the design was a mediating force, not something reaching to the heavens, but rather mediating between money, matter, and metabolic activity. So what I want to focus on for a few minutes here is how specifically the building contract operated. In particular, I want to describe how architects position the contract as a device for controlling market-based activity of building in the rapidly developing environment of market capitalism, an environment which architects wanted to both participate in and keep their distance from. That is, I'm interested in how the contract, or what I will be calling the contractual design, was a tool for architects to try to be in, but not of the world. So when I describe the contractual design or the contract, I actually mean a collection of documents. An 1858 specification document for a courthouse in Lawrence, Massachusetts lays this out clearly. Quote, the plans, specification, and articles of agreement shall constitute the contract. When I say contractual design, it's this triumvirate that is what I intend to capture. So the modern theory and practice of contract, which developed over the late 18th and early 19th centuries in the US, was born of multiple parents. But most important for our purposes here is the freedom of contract's central place in the formation of market capitalism. As Morton Horwitz argues in The Transformation of American Law, the conversion of contract law into its modern form in the first half of the 19th century has to be understood as a reflection of the development of a market society. The modern contract is, he says, an expression of, quote, the ideology of a market economy. And this, it is an expression of the Enlightenment conception of the independent liberal subject who has agency as an economic actor. Viewed as a contract, then, the design was a technology of codifying informed consent and reciprocity in these kind of voluntary market exchanges of building. So in architectural history, we have accounts of how architectural form embodies the ideas of enlightenment. What I'm suggesting is that attending to the history of the architectural contract gives us another way to think about how the very identity of the individual and quasi-autonomous architect and the formation of their profession was caught up in the wider developments of visions of enlightenment liberal subjectivity. So one of the key aspects of Horwitz's argument is actually that the contractual form that developed in the early 19th century was not just in relationship to present tense exchange, but more importantly to exchanges projected into the future. The contract in its modern legal form was born out of speculation on future prices of goods and time-delayed global commodity markets. In fact, the shift from US courts focusing on equity in contract disputes to focus on what they called considered consent was in part a product of agreements made around future unpredictable marketplaces. So the court was not there to judge whether a deal was fair or not, for no one could know if a deal was fair if it was made in relationship to something yet to have occurred. All the courts were to judge was whether parties consensually entered into this unpredictable relationship. So the orientation of the modern contract towards the future was particularly appealing for architectural design. The design was in its very essence a plan for something yet to be done. And as a contract, it was an agreement about something to be delivered over an extended period of time. Let's think about this in relationship to completeness. The standard specification and agreement that A.J. Davis created and used in the 1840s and 50s began with a preface, quote, the writing and figuring on all the drawings are to be considered as part and parcel of this specification. And this specification and the drawings are to be considered as reciprocally illustrative of each other. The drawings and the specs were harmonious and filled in each other's completeness. But there's another step in this introduction that is particularly striking. It stipulates that drawings that are incomplete are nonetheless, quote, to be understood as if they had been distinctly and severally shown complete. These describes the incompleteness of drawings as the core of the way architects work, leaving them partially complete such that they avoid the labors of repetition. So the architect's avoidance of repetition in their representation had to itself be stated as part of the contract. The architect's drawings of a door like this one, for example, could be incomplete, but of course the builder's construction could not. It may seem trivial or obvious to observe that the builder cannot just put up one door, but this distinction harbors within it a particular conception of work. The architect's work was not in the repetitions themselves. These were actually to be avoided if possible. Rather, the architect's work was in the kind of work of conception that takes place in ideation. And in this case, and in particular in the case of design competition, the ideation of difference or uniqueness or the best. So we could say a lot about this kind of distinction of difference and repetition that's already set up. But to return to specs, Thomas Eustick Walter went even further along these lines of completion and incompleteness. In the general conditions of some of his 1840 specifications, Walter describes the importance of workmanlike execution of the design, quote, whether the same shall have been herein specified or not. In fact, he continues, the work that may not have been specifically mentioned shall be furnished by the contractor as though it had been particularly specified. So the architect was defining documentary incompleteness as nonetheless complete. The contractor was to do the undescribed work as if it was precisely described. So architects also wrote temporality into their contracts. Take, for instance, the New York architect Richard Upjohn's modification of a contract by a prolific publisher of legal blanks when he was writing up the contract for an 1851 church. The builder was to follow the drawings and specifications that Upjohn and Company had made and provided those that Upjohn and Company had made and provided with the contract, and those that Upjohn inserted by hand were to be made. This kind of language was common in contracts in the 1850s. The contract was both for a design done and at the same time, a design not yet finished. Thus, what I'm trying to get at is that the architecturally plotted building contract worked in favor of architects by suggesting that there's an implicit completeness, even when there is incompleteness. And as I began, the standard conditions that Davis set in the conditions for this contract gave him an enormous amount of power. Other architects did very similar things. Take, for instance, one of the rights that Thomas Eustick Walter gives himself in the standard contracts that he used in Philadelphia in the 1830s. The architect, he says, has the full right to nullify the contract with no possibility of appeal if the builder's performance was inadequate. So while the architect may have been an angel with dirty hands, these were, at least as they saw it, very powerful hands. Indeed, these were hands that produced a complete document, even when it appeared incomplete. And these implicitly complete documents loaded an enormous amount of asymmetrical authority on the architect as apparently a neutral and independent voice in the contract itself. So I focus on this time period between the 1830s to 1860s for several reasons. In some of the historical literature, this period is often referred to as a moment of stagnation. It gets characterized as a kind of doldrums between the genius of Benjamin Henry Latrobe and the post-Civil War wave of professionalization and large-scale urban construction. And it's indeed a moment that's caught between the devastating financial depression in the mid-1830s and then one that occurred again in the late 1850s, which was quickly followed by the Civil War. But what I argue more broadly is that this moment of stagnation is in fact the sedimentation of a way of practice. It's a moment when architects all along the Eastern Seaboard were not only developing the contractual design, they were also getting up in front of audiences, like countless other professionals and dilettantes, and lecturing on the moral and political value of their practice. For example, the New York architect A.J. Davis told an audience in New York in 1841 that good architecture was necessary, but was being prevented from emerging in the city because Americans kept confusing mere builders for true architects. In fact, he told them, quoting the English architect John Soane, that it was ignorant, unskillful, and lazy builders who were motivated only by money that kept ruining the artistic work of the architects like him. In a sense, this language is unsurprising in that it mimics the kind of racialized class dynamics of market capitalism. Architects started to resort to the professional title when it became useful to distinguish themselves from builders and those that they figured as of a lower class. The title of architect became a tool of class distinction. But what is also revealing about this is the particular way it conceives of the architect's agency and purpose. So that is the identity of the architect that was formulated in the early 19th century US was formulated around tensions around the kind of source of professional authority. The tension was between the image of the architect as a neutral mediator and the architects whose authority was licensed because they could act as a world historical orchestrator. The contract was a useful tool in trying to stitch together these two identities. And its formulation as the working out, but not being the source of architectural authority, the contract allowed the architect to pursue an identity that aimed at being in, but not of the marketplace. And I think the reason I think this is such an interesting document, the Charles A. Davis House contract, is that it illustrates the kind of limits of an ideational vision of design, one in which the architect was put under erasure in the market exchange that realized the building. This was sort of an ideal vision, design freed from the burden of building, which the architect could only asymptotically approach. The architect wanted to be a mediator whose license came from beyond the market at the world historical level, yet that still directed it. So the authoring of this document, yet striking oneself from it, is a way of both claiming authority and trying to stay out of the mess. So I would say in general, that to me is the kind of architectural gospel that that architects were generating in the early 19th century. So that's an overview or kind of some thoughts about a particular part of this project that I'm working on. What I'll do here is just like a few more minutes so we can have as much time to actually just discuss. So what I had originally thought I was going to do in this talk was split it in half and spend the second half talking about another project that I'm working on. One that attends to the kind of transformations of the built environment in the US South in the kind of period between the 1870s and the 1930s. What is between Reconstruction and the New Deal. The project uses architecture to think about the volatile mix of memory and industrialization that shapes the rapidly transforming Southern world. But of course, you realize that maybe sometimes it's better to say less than more. So I'll just say that I've put pieces of this out there. I just published this piece earlier this year. That's a bit more of a piece in a popular form, but kind of speculating on some of the large questions that I'm thinking about this project. And I've got the first kind of large piece of research from this that's slated to come out in the JSAH sometime in the next year, or fingers crossed within the next year, depending on their schedule. And I also want to point out that here at UT, the kind of digitized collections of the Southern Architect and Building News is already providing an invaluable resource for developing this project. So as I'm trying to think through the South, not as a kind of backwater, but rather as a training ground for other forms of 20th century resource extraction at the hands of the building industry, these kind of early publications and discussions about architecture, and particularly the advertisements in these journals, in this journal, have been really interesting. So let me kind of end and wrap all this up by trying to link the ambitions of my second project to the first. And through thinking about how I see the task of the architectural historian. So I'll do this by borrowing a slide I used during my job talk here almost 2 years ago. Again, quoting Manfredo Tafuri. Tafuri called out a certain tendency towards placing architecture between parentheses within the flux of things generated by the system of production. He said we could call this kind of way of working an act of architecture done to the boudoir. As many of us here well know, this chapter from The Sphere and the Labyrinth, the Architecture dans le Boudoir chapter, describes architecture culture in the 1970s and 80s as a kind of bedroom game, bracketed off from the flux of global capitalism. And Tafuri's critique basically is that architecture just winds up recreating that outside inside of itself with even more tedious and capricious versions of competition and exchange. So I think of my task as a historian as to unbracket, to put architecture back into the flux of things. That doesn't mean that we eliminate the discussion of brackets or parentheses. We have to think really carefully about this work of bracketing and how it is a response to economic and political and material conditions, and how itself is a form of economic and political and material activity. but we can't let those brackets operate in how we scope out the work of our historical projects. So we have to get architecture into the flux of things, both to consider its limits and also to envision alternative forms of agency. So this is the approach I've been working on in Survey 2 this semester, where we've been modulating the history of architecture 4 times through 4 different themes about architecture's context. Now, the project's inevitably messy and difficult. There's in no way being held together by a refined single grand narrative. But I think we can call on an old friend here, Walter Benjamin, to see how this is indeed a feature, not a bug of historical thinking. And I'm not going to read the quote that we've all probably seen dozens of times, but basically this kind of idea of the past as a pile of wreckage, something that's hurled at the feet of the angel, rather than something that is easily seen as a kind of linear progressive history, is something I'm trying to think through. For the students this semester, I've suggested maybe there's a kind of more Southern version of Clay's Angelus Novus, and it's the bless this mess sign that we see in our kitchens sometimes. This is going to be messy necessarily. And I say that finally to say, to kind of shamelessly plug myself again, this is what shapes the kind of seminars that I want to teach, and the one I'll be teaching next semester, where we put the architecture back into the messy flux of things in which it swims. All right, thank you.
I guess we jump in.
Go for it.
Thanks, Leora, for organizing this, Nuria for the introductions, and Brian for inviting us to the discussion. It's a very insightful and thoughtful presentation, but I think I'll start with another binary. Straightforward to questioning, but I'm thinking about our age-old dilemma here as architecture historians. How do we make this read? How do we do history for architects? Or how might we bring historical concerns within the studio practice, thinking about education?
Yeah, it's a huge and million-dollar question, right? And one that I hope everybody here can speak to, and we can have a conversation about. But it seems to me, like I was saying at the end, it seemed my task is trying to, at least in a history class, to try to trouble the way we put brackets on and the way we would define the limits of architecture. So in a sense, like we just start teaching all these other things as well. And it's going to be messy, but we have to think about the kind of, for me, thinking about the practice of bracketing, like this first book project is thinking about that the practice of trying to define architecture and trying to define architecture as a profession itself as one of these larger things in the brackets. Like the very activity of trying to define architecture as a political and economic and material issue itself. It's an issue that allows us to bring in these kind of questions about all these other outsides. So to me, at least, I find like hammering on that question of like, what is an architect? Why did we shape the term this way? What other ways could we shape that term is a way to both talk about like the way we framed what we do and also kind of open up other possibilities. So that's my initial thought, but I know there's so much to say about this.
Well, Alex, go. I have another question later.
Thank you so much, Brian, for your intriguing presentation, and thank you to the organizers. Although you did not mention him today in your presentation, I know that you often reference Karol Polanyi and his notion of fictitious commodities, the idea that land, labor, and money are embedded in the social relationships that negotiate the substantive, in his terms, bonds that people have with each other and their environment, and that these categories, land, labor, and money, have value defined by their social embeddedness, pre-existing their valorization into capital within a capitalist market-based exchange. And your discussion of the architectural contract suggests that it was a tool which architects used to valorize their own labor, and that this valorization constructed a double identity, as you mentioned, namely the architect as the master of world historical ideas, aesthetics, and morals, and the architect as a neutral mediator, a protector of both parties, builders and clients, in a market-based exchange. So the architect was in the market as a neutral mediator, and at the same time above the market as the master of world historical ideas, aesthetics, and morals. And this is the universal dimension of building qua architecture. But perhaps what is lost in this self-valorization of architects is a form of architectural labor imminent to socially embedded building processes. And we can discuss what the nature of that imminent labor is. But I was wondering whether, to bring it to the present day, whether you see the quote unquote ethical turn, as some people have called it, which has taken place over the past decade or so in architecture, as a re-authentication of the role of architects within and not outside or above socially embedded building processes in the world, and how you anticipate this will affect the future of the architectural profession or professional identity in the US or more generally.
Yeah, I mean, those are a kind of amazing set of thoughts to string together, and it's really provocative. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea that I could imagine using the framework of fictitious commodities to think about what I'm calling the contractual design as itself a kind of fictitious commodity. It's an attempt to make a thing that's exchangeable on the market that in fact is much more than that. And then in that process of creating a kind of thing that's only understood in terms of its relationship to the marketplace, architects, I could see saying like these early 19th century architects also were trying to reformulate a way of imagining their practices as much more than that. So the kind of ideology of architecture is about ideating in the grand scale of world historical change as some sort of a ideological veneer that's put on top of this kind of market-based exchange. And then it seems like the question becomes, is that process of creating that veneer that tries to say it's more than market exchange, is that process tracking what Boyani would say is like the pre kind of capitalistic, like true kind of conditions of building, or what we could, if we're just going to use the word architecture for everything, what we could call architecting that's much more socially embedded, or are those two things different? Like is the narrative, the use of the historical narrative to create this kind of ambitious view of the architect as a world historical orchestrator, is that connected to this kind of form of architectural labor that's more imminent to the material conditions, or is it something different? And that seems like the question worth kind of thinking out here. And I imagine, I mean, it seems to me that history provides a really good way to think through it, right? The historical framework is being used by these early 19th century architects to picture their practice in a certain way. And if we start to think critically about how they create that framework of history, we could imagine that we'd start to interrogate whether that historical framework is creating a kind of veneer or something that is operating ideologically, or and I guess if it's operating ideologically, which way is it operating ideologically? So yeah, so I don't know the answer to that part, but to say that seems like a key question here is the kind of narrative about the ideation of design. Is that something else, or is that something that is the kind of closing of things inside of parentheses, which is necessarily a result of architecture getting called in market capitalism. And then kind of to the other part, I'll just say briefly, like, yeah, it's somebody that spends most of their time in the 19th century. I feel very uncomfortable speculating on where things are going. But it does seem like that question of the ethical turn, if it's a re-authentication of architecture, a lot of that has to do with this kind of previous question of like, what do we mean by architecture, and how much is this connected to the historical plots that, for example, were very dominant in the 19th century and the ones that we're working towards today. So again, I imagine like a kind of the work of a historian could be really useful here to at least in, you know, thinking through these kind of other frameworks of fictitious commodities. Maybe we can see Polanyi suggesting like, well, here's how you could think about land that's not purely within the framework of the market. What is the analogy there to talking about building or architectural practice? That's that seems like $1 million question, but it seemed to me it makes sense as like the right one to think through. So thanks. You just, you know, you reframed some stuff for me to think more carefully about.
Oh, sure. Barbara, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so maybe giving more time for Brian to elaborate on this idea of completeness, of like this element that has been very much included in the contract we are discussing. For us right now, it's a misnomer. We not completing a design makes it think it's a way of communicating, right? It became a practice of architecture, thinking about how we are communicating, not reworking, yes, not doing extra labor, but also making drawing the design cleaner to make for the sake of communication. And thinking about communication, how do you have any thoughts on how that changed the contract, the architectural contract changing over history, like thinking that, okay, we don't need to include those terms anymore, completeness, temporality, but basically stating what the deliverables would be of removing those ideas. Yeah, maybe something around that.
Yeah, I mean, this is also a really big question. There's not a ton of people that have written on architectural contracts, but there's a nice article by Katie Lloyd Thomas and Thilo Amhoff that's in I'm losing the name of the book, but Peggy Deemer edited it. There's a nice kind of long history there. And then Howard Davis in a book called The Culture of Building has a chapter that kind of builds a little bit longer arc. And I know Katie Lloyd Thomas has a book that's coming out soon that focuses on specifications specifically, but tries to build a longer story. And like what I gather from them and kind of the way I see these 19th century contracts, at least, is that one way we could describe it is that there's a shift. There's a shift as contracts get bigger, as the contractual conception of architecture gets more expansive. We see a shift from qualitative language to quantitative language. We see a shift from language that would generally kind of say something like, well, use, and this still occurs, and it occurs a lot in the 19th century, but to say like, it'll say like, use the best wood, or this must be done in the best way possible. Or it'll say things like, these contracts will say stuff like, in the most workmanlike way possible, or it will use these superlatives and also kind of baseline terminology to define how labor or material is done and selected. And that's very common in the 19th century, and it's even more so prior to this, right? When there's 18th century contracts that are even shorter. But you can see that start to go away, even over the career of someone like Davis. The early contracts he has that I've found are 1830s or short. By the time you get to the 1870s, their specifications are being printed by large legal printers, and they're 20, 30 pages already. And you see a shift in the kind of way of the format of the language there. And I think the longer arc of the story would be something similar. One of the things that Amhoff and Thomas also identify is that there's a shift in contracts from focusing on the means and methods in the 19th century of how to build to in the 20th century really talking about quantitative or talking to the ends of construction. So the contract shift from saying like, here's what the labor needs to do in order to do this, to actually talking about here's what the deliverable objects qualities have to be in order to be acceptable. And so I think that shift from a discussion of means to ends is also something that we could probably track some of this through, and track in particular the kind of slow division between the general contractor and the architect themselves. So I think there's a couple of ways you could probably do it. And a lot of it would revolve around like what things are assumed, what things are made explicit, and the kind of proliferation of all these mediating devices, basically. The proliferation of the contractual design as a larger and larger set of drawings, set of written documents, etc. Yeah.
Leora, you posted your question in the chat. Do you want to ask your question, or I could read it? And then Chris has his hand up.
Sure. You're sort of inadvertently answering some of it, I think, as you answer the other questions. But I was wondering if you find that they're like this position of the architect, sort of navigating this middle ground, is something like if you see something distinctly American about it during this period in the United States, because like there's obviously this long history of the, architect in this role between the, church patronage and also just being like an economic driver. But what about this position do you see as kind of distinctly American? And is it race? Is it related to American notions of labor? Like, what is distinct about this?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things here. Like there's first the kind of narrative of how do we place this in relationship to a longer history of architectural practice that in particular we might think about kind of like Renaissance definitions of the architect and how those connect or don't connect into the discussion here about ideation. So there's certainly a longer history that this would be a part of. And I think the other thing that's worth saying is like many of the sources for these US contracts are actually English documents. So, I mean, this is kind of, and this is stuff I've only like in the last couple of months as I've really been digging into the text specifically and sorting through where are they getting these things from. Like parts of the contract, the Davis contract I just showed you, were copied directly out of Loudon's encyclopedia that was published in the 1830s. And we could start to trace an intellectual history of architecture through contracts, and I think we could trace like literally like what is allowed to be copied and repeated from other people, like a kind of view of what is repeatable and what is not as an architect. So this definition certainly goes back to the circles around John Soane and the UK, and there's definitely a longer plot to fit it into. I think at least, so I don't know if I want to claim that there's some unique Americanness. And I would be uncomfortable with that framework and with using the national framework to define the project. But I think by working from stuff in this situation, there's a couple of things that come out. And one of them is the kind of overt way that history is imploded as a racialized history, and how that might connect to a discussion of labor. The way Protestant nationalism is really informative of some of the discussions here, I think is also kind of unique to at least to the people that I'm looking at. Then I think the other thing that I would say is like the kind of rapid rise of the context of the market in the US, like the kind of rapid rise of market capitalism in that transformation in the first kind of 3 to 4 decades of the 19th century, I think is the other aspect that I'm really trying to set it in relationship to. There might be other comparative cases that are similar, but I think that the kind of way that the history of capitalism people, but going back to some writing in the 90s and a little bit later than that, like Peter Sellers' book, The Market Revolution, was kind of something that really shook this kind of idea of how central the kind of capitalization and turn to the market was at this moment. It just seems like a really easy or really useful moment to think about architecture in that kind of lens of capitalism that we're still dealing with. So yeah, I would say those are kind of the aspects of it that at least seem potent, or the reason I would think about it this way in this location. Chris, I think your hand is up. Yeah.
Just didn't want to interrupt anyone. Thanks, Brian, for a wonderfully pithy talk. I always enjoy people who get right to the heart of the matter quickly. The 1830s to 1860s is such an interesting period because we're between Latrobe, we're between a British educated architect or an English educated architect, and the time when the first Americans who are being educated at the École des Beaux-Arts are returning.
Yeah.
Which means we're looking mostly at native-born and American educated architects, to the extent that architects were educated in that period very well. My question's somewhat close to Leora's, but slightly different. I'm assuming you're familiar with the book by one of our graduates, Kate Holliday, on Leopold Eidlitz.
Yeah.
I'm curious about whether figures like Eidlitz, who come from outside of the American context, are operating in any way differently, particularly early on. I know later on, Eidlitz has huge legal problems when he builds the Connecticut State House, right? It's famous or infamous. Do we see him operating differently? He's also not Protestant, he's Jewish, so that too plays a role. Is there anything discernible there and anything interesting that comes out of that case? And are there any other cases like that that you know of?
Yeah, that's great. I love Kate's book. It's one of the first things that I've read working in this period or one of the few things I've read working in this period that I think really takes into account the complexity of the social condition and the complexity of like the AIA itself. When she talks about the 1950s formation of the AIA, points out these people are not in agreement with one another on what architecture is, and they butt heads on a lot of kind of very substantial issues. So I really love her work. And
Eidlitz is such a cantankerous character, right? So
there's this moment I love. He's at one of the kind of early, it might be 1959 or 60 kind of meeting of the AIA, and one of the restaurants, Delmonico's, I think, that they would meet in New York. And he gets up and he says, architects are concerned about history in a way no one else is. That also makes us more disappointed with everything than anybody else is. That kind of sheer disappointment, it seems, I think that his kind of negative attitude seems a little bit different than some of the other architects. But I mean, I have two thoughts, or maybe three thoughts on this. Like, one of them is that what I find really interesting about the fact that Hunt and the people that come back from the École des Beaux-Arts in the 1950s come back into 1850s. This occurs in my writing too. I'm like, off by a century. So they come back in the 1850s. It's they are coming back into a situation where the kind of scope of what it looks like to practice architecture professionally has already been put in place. And that's what I'm really interested in about this kind of 1830s to 50s moment, is that even though it's stagnant in the sense that it's a bunch of people trained by Latrobe or many of them homegrown, like they're fighting about whether we should be Grecian maniacs or whether we need to build in this style. Like the debates within them about what architecture should look like feel very stultifying, but the patterns of establishing like a bourgeois commercial practice is what seems really interesting, and the thing that gets locked in place. So when Hunt comes back, even though there's these kind of ideas about the École des Beaux-Arts and the Atelier, and eventually winds up shaping the early architecture schools, the patterns for how a practice would make money and how a practice would operate are already established. So I think, to me, that's what's like fascinating about this period is who cares about their architecture? A bunch of it doesn't seem particularly exciting to me, but what they did is they shaped a notion of practice, and it's a lot of people that following after the wave of Latrobe. So that's what I think the kind of the gap in the middle could open up to think about the other thing I was thinking about is that Eidlitz is really interesting, right? Because he's one of the few that proposes like a nationally organized architecture school. And you see a few other people suggest this possibility, but Eidlitz is definitely the one that's pushing hardest for a nationalized architectural education. And it never actually manifests, right? We wind up getting a kind of the American, like in architectural education, the federalist version of architecture, right? We distribute it to the states. You normally do it in state institutions, and you start licensure in the 1890s at the state level. So all these kind of ideas for some sort of national unification that he suggests, they all never materialize because everything in institutional form gets distributed. So I think that the kind of tension between someone like him that has an institutional idea about how to create a national architecture, and a bunch of the other architects that want a national architecture but can't imagine that institutional arrangement, I think that's also really interesting. Like the ambitions for architecture that he talks about are ones that many other people had, but the institutional reality that got manifest never matches up to it.
Have you seen any contracts from Eidlitz from this period, or do any exist?
I don't have any right now. I think I'll have to look back through Kate's book if she points to any. I haven't found any yet, though.
To see if there are any differences, because he comes from the practice model. So that would be worth, I think, pursuing.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to pop off, so don't think I'm running away, but I have to be in New York in a minute. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks for coming, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. It was really lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Brian, a more general question. You say that your task as a historian is to unbracket, to put architecture back into the flux of things, right? Quoting Manfredo Tafuri. Of course, buildings are reifications of social and economic relationships. However, buildings also exceed all of the components in a spec sheet, for example, labor enumerated in a work schedule. All of these different factors coalesce to produce a new object, ontological, right? An architectural object. How do you, as a historian, reduce the angle or the gap between these two seemingly diverging tendencies, or how do you straddle the line between bracketing and unbracketing?
Yeah, that's another like $1 million question that I feel like we should all be having conversations about and how we teach history, right? How do you teach? And it is even more pronounced when you're teaching in an architecture school, right? How do I teach about a thing that we are in the legacy of, and it's still literally shaping the kind of institutional or disciplinary boundaries of how we think about what we do? I mean, we all always want to challenge them, but it's there as an institutional apparatus. So we are in the legacy of that, and we also want to think critically about that thing. So how do we have a productive conversation in the classroom, for example, that's pedagogically productive, where we're both engaging the question of architecture as able to do something, and at the same time critiquing architecture and its kind of sense that it is running up against the conditions around it, right? Like I know one version of teaching a survey class or teaching to architects would be to like be resolutely disappointed, like Tafuri is in much of his writing, right? To just be like, well, you thought you had agency, but if we follow the story right, like this was caused by this was caused by that. Oh, I'm really sorry. Like I am here to pull the rug out from under everything, right? So that version of imploding things seems deeply disappointing to me and unproductive. And I mean unproductive in the sense that it seems to me like that would be a version of buying into a kind of unalterable or necessary plot to history. That seems to me like that would be buying into to negativity to a kind of nihilism in the same way that the kind of absolute positivity of a story that's like, we did this style, then you should do this style or figure out what the next style is a kind of other version of positivity. So it seems like trying to sit on that line to both show, I don't know. I've told students in the past, and I didn't say this year, but in the past I've said, I'm going to do two. I'm going to be kind of almost schizophrenic here. I'm going to argue this and I'm going to argue that, and we're going to bounce back and forth. But I don't think that quite hits the nail on the head. It does seem like they're like hitting the nail on, like contingency seems like the key issue, to be able to tell students that things can change. The reason we think about history, I mean, I've said this a couple of times, it's a pithy way of saying it. It's like, yeah, history helps make the past present to us, but what's really useful is that it lets us know the present can pass, that we can make things change, and we don't know where things are going. So emphasizing contingency maybe is a way to make it a particularly productive practice for architects, that, yeah, I don't know where things are going, but it's possible that they could go anywhere because things are contingent. So yeah, I don't know if that's a great answer, but maybe contingency is the key.
Clarifying the limits of our agency, I think, ultimately. I wanted to read, well, Alan just dropped a question in the chat before he left. He writes, is there a connection with the ways professional contracts and engineering were being written in the 19th century? In the early to mid parts of the century, there would have been large private sector contracts being written, and some with project and financial failure. Could that level of civil/industrial scope have introduced or induced a larger desire or need for professionalization across the built environment? Thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I haven't spent time digging in to look at engineering contracts at the same time, but that's obviously, it's something I need to do. I actually definitely need to look at engineering contracts, particularly those that are used by architects that are bouncing between calling themselves an architect and calling themselves an engineer when it's convenient. So that's a really fantastic observation of work that needs to get done. So maybe now we're a year and a half out from the book. But it does seem like, yeah, this kind of question of like, I would definitely say, like, in the 1840s, the kind of Whig position in the US is that we need to improve everything. They called this the American system, that we need to build infrastructure, and that's what grows the nation, as the kind of infrastructural materialization of national identity. And so in that case, like, it's really easy to see how engineering gets linked with progress, because more roads, more trains, more canals, you could link that directly. The architects have a harder time convincing people that, you need classical architecture in order for things to improve. The steps in that argument are more substantial. So it does seem like he's hitting on something there too, is like looking at that that could be another way to think about this parallel between engineers and architects, is to think about the way they contract things, because the way they contract things is more readily accessible to people as a version of improving things. Architects are trying to contract a kind of practice that itself people are really skeptical of. Like, most of these architects I'm writing about, they just complain constantly because people just go out and hire somebody that's not an architect, or people go out and do some sort of work that is subpar to what an architect would want. So yeah, it's a great way into it too.
I don't know how we are on time, Leora, how far we go.
We can hang out as long as you all want to, as long as Brian has time.
I have time. I have time right now. I'm still alive. Yeah, I'm still breathing.
Let's encourage other questions from the audience.
I mean, I would also be really interested in just hearing how people, there's several other people teaching history in here. Like, how do we think about what it is that we're doing in relationship to the people that we are teaching, that are learning to do the thing we're teaching a history of? I have my strategies right now, but I still don't know if they're the right ones. I'd love to hear from everyone else.
What strategies are you thinking of, Brian? First of all, it was a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
Really, yes.
Thanks.
It's terrific work. Really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I was saying, kind of centering the dilemma of the professional architect seems like a useful way of kind of getting into why we might talk about both the conditions that create that are kind of outside our scope and talk about our disciplinary problem at the same time. If we focus on professionalization, on the very formation of the idea of the architect, we can keep oscillating back and forth. Like, why do you call that architecture? Why is this what architects do? And that can be a provocative way of generating a reason to talk about architectural history. So I'm thinking about techniques kind of like that. How do we frame our teaching in relationship to practitioners?
Yes, and maybe also with the broader context of the social situation of the architect or the landscape architect, and what young designers have to contend with in today's world, how to map that.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, as am I interrupting?
No, I'm just musing.
For me, it was very inspiring as a non-historian and coming more from practice. What I thought was, I love your lecture, Brian, and what made me think is something that I've always thought is a little problematic when with our own notion of what the architect is, especially when associated, and I really love how you used images to kind of summarize, certain concepts. And then I thought those two paintings of the architect as a mediator and the architect with these higher aspirational notions of ideation, etc., that are somehow always removing us from the actual market, and not just the market, but labor, as in, and the idea of labor itself, or even a notion of class. And I think that's a little problematic, like same with artists, because isn't that kind of what takes us to contemporary conditions where we sometimes not paid for things because we're like think that we are divorced, want to divorce ourselves from those material dirtiness, and in fact we don't discuss a lot of that in school, and I find that like how that notion of what the architect is, a little bit problematic in those terms, and I think I'm sure you've thought a lot more about that than me, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean that all that makes so much sense to me. The connection between trying to remove oneself from the market conditions of capitalism there's ways that connects a kind of 18th century gentlemanly identity. Like, I don't get my hands dirty. I don't have to worry about money because I'm part of the landed gentry. Well, the architects for the most part, aren't actually in that position. So the desire to aspire to that kind of position where I'm not primarily driven by the market is something that's common to 19th century professions. They want to present themselves in this way, is that you have to pay me, but I'm not driven by you paying me. I'm driven by the good, but you do have to pay me to get the good out of me. But on the other hand, that's not what's driving me. Like, that desire to position oneself seems powerful, and it might work for doctors and lawyers in the 19th century is particularly lawyers that very quickly, create a kind of environment in which they're needed. Architects are having a harder time convincing people that you'd have to hire me rather than just hire any builder. But this kind of desire to not be part of the market opens up possibilities for exploitation, right? That architects, we still see ourselves as like, this is a calling. That's why I use that in the title, where you're called to architecture. And you still hear people say this, like, you should pursue it because it's your passion. And then for that reason, we can hire interns and not pay them much, or like pay people for 40 hours of work a week and actually work them 70 hours. Because we still have this kind of tension between what we imagine ourselves committed to and this market that we don't really want to be a part of. So I think that the other way to see that playing out in the 19th century and today too is like design competitions. Like, all these architects I'm talking about, they complain about design competitions constantly, and then they keep entering them. They're like, you should be paying us for our work. You should pay me, even if I don't win the competition. And there's even lawsuits where some of them sue a competition to get paid even though they didn't win. They think they should be paid for their time, but then they all just keep entering competitions and trying to like
Need to
suss
enter
out.
them.
Yeah, like to suss out the tension between those two. That kind of condition too, I think is really seems really important, because that is part of why we still we still do it, right? Yeah, so I think that all makes a lot of sense. Like, competitions are really a really great place to think through this, I think.
Has there been work, Brian, on the competition as a concept and maybe its relationship to law, jurors in the courtroom versus jurors in the competition? I'm just curious what kind of approaches there have been.
There is a book that's like a history of competitions that I think is Helen Lipstadt and somebody else edited. I'll have to find it. There was one volume that's kind of like a collected volume of essays that's been published on competition, but for as far as I have been able to tell, there's not a lot of work out there on the history of the competition other than this volume.
That's amazing.
And it's something like, so I published a really short piece in the JAE a couple years ago on competition, on one particular competition. And I do fundamentally think like design competitions are like the kind of even more superfluous, nebulous, like capricious version of the competitive bid that's taking place in the market. At least in the US, these things are happening in parallel in some way. So there's definitely something there. And so part of the second chapter of my book is like really thinking about the competition form at this moment. But yeah, there's that one volume, I think, yeah, Barry Bergdahl and Helene Lipstadt organized it. It's called The Experimental Tradition. And it was published in 1989. And it's probably like 5 or 6 essays on the history of competition. But I really haven't seen more stuff on it right now. It seems like a thing there should be a lot on, right?
Exactly. It's really astounding. Yeah.
Well, and you see architects every once in a while kind of get together and say, we need to stop this exploitative practice of competitions, but we keep doing it. Like they would say it over and over in their journals in 1830s and 40s and 50s, and then all keep competing with each other. So, and it's a way to drive schools too, right? You can drive the kind of projects that are done in design studios by creating national competitions. So it still works.
Yes, it's a living structure.
Yeah.
And there is a narrowing of what constitutes design labor in the universal aspirations of architects, and therefore a narrowing of the work that we receive remuneration for.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the hole that we've got ourselves in, or the architects have got themselves in.
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me, yes, there are many changes in particulars, but the broad strokes of what you're describing, so much are still live, live contests, live issues. Those two, update your 2 paintings to, you've got 2 selfies of the architect today.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the way the lecture should work or this content should work whenever I am talking to a mostly group of architects themselves, is I need like the 2 contemporary pictures that are next to it. I don't know exactly who they're like the spec writer in an office, and then there's like, I don't know, Bjarke Ingels or somebody that's a big idea person.
You'll find him. You'll find him.
But I think
her.
Yeah. I think
that was a them.
Okay.
I think that parallel
Probably
is
be a him in that context.
yeah. But yeah, absolutely. I to me, one of the reasons to write this book and think about this moment is it seems like a moment when a bunch of these things are congealing under the kind of contemporary conditions of capitalism that we're in. I mean, that's nothing particularly interesting or new to say, right? This is what all the history of capitalism people are arguing now, is like that that the 19th century, especially the early part of the 19th century, like lots of things are organizing themselves that we're in the wake of. The history is much longer than that, obviously, but if we can see moments where the order of kind of capitalistic exchange takes hold, we can start to think about the world that we're in. Yeah.
I was thinking about what you were saying about the profession, and also what Mirka has been teaching in her hybridities seminar. And I wondered if first, the competitions as an outlet to achieve that ideal of the architect benefactor that is saving the world with a project. And I wonder if, because we're more constrained in who is hiring us, we are, what I wanted to do was like bring what Mirka brought in her classes, these projects that are landscape projects, and they act as what they are supposed to be, but then they are part infrastructure, part social project, and they are able to do that because maybe the who is hiring is actually thinking about the greater good, if you want to say. And I wonder, like, is there is there a specialization that we're gonna have in architecture that it's gonna lead us to, okay, you are gonna be able to get into these particular social projects, but it's a very small piece of the cake of architecture. So
Yeah. I mean, that question of client and the fact that architects, the way we have positioned our way of making money as a way that's entirely dependent on a client's desire for a particular project, means that architects' agency in terms of what they practice, what they do is very constrained, right? And there, of course, are practices that resist this. I guess you could think of like shop architects that puts themselves kind of on that border between developer and architect, that try to take control of some of the kind of financial side of things, which would free them to do the things, to make decisions in terms of how finance works in relationship to their project, which that seems like a key potential for finding other forms of agency. There were, examples in the late 18th, early 19th century in the US of people doing this. Charles Bulfinch tried to build some speculative stuff in Boston and went bankrupt. But prior to him, like most of Philadelphia was built by or big chunks of the kind of just fabric of Philadelphia, the kind of infill fabric of the kind of brick townhouses were built by carpenters on spec. Like the actual like trades and people that were in guilds at that point were building on spec, and that gave them a lot of control over the so they were speculatively building, right, and then selling these units after they had created them. So they had a lot of control over what was happening in the environment. So I imagine that line of the fact that Sohn defined architects as mediating between clients and builders, and he said, you can't be the client because then your interest is on the side of money, and you can't be the builder because then your interest is on the side of the builder. You purposely cannot be both of those in order to be a neutral mediator. That is both a way of like taking away risk and responsibility, and it's also a way of losing agency. So maybe it does mean you have to give up on some of that your hands are going to get dirty, I guess, would be what happens.
I think that's another of the tensions that's still there, as you were describing the attempts at professionalization of the architect and the tension with the need to make a living, the need to pretend you weren't in it for the living. That was about professional autonomy, but so is the question of agency. You get more agency, you have more responsibility, you leave the financial problems on the side of the owner and the builder, and you have the ability later on to say, well, that's they ruined it because, or you don't even need the because. It's I got it right, but
yeah.
Again, still attention, and different architects have different ideas of where they, what they want between autonomy and agency. Agency reduces autonomy because then you're the one who's got to answer for the consequences.
Yeah. I gave a talk at the Berlage this morning, 5:30 here this morning. But one of the slides that I use is AJ Davis. He gets a letter from a builder that's on his way to becoming or calling himself an architect in Providence, Rhode Island, and like 1829. And he says something. He says to AJ Davis, he says, "You are so lucky to have your library that you can go kind of sit in your library and close your doors, because I, as a builder, know the pains both of like working with labor out there in the real world, and I know the pains of clients cutting budgets and me having to cut the ornament off." So he was basically saying like, yeah, you have the joy of drawing all the ornament you want and placing it in this grand history, and I unfortunately have the kind of the pain of having to take that stuff away or fail at executing that. So that there's a lot of freedom in closing the doors of the library.
I must ask, as our Rhode Island representative, who that was.
Buckland. It's James Buckland. Yeah. I forgot. You are a Rhode Islander. That's excellent. Yeah.
Brian, you mentioned shop architects. And to pose the same question to you that you posed to Michael Kimmelman, if you follow any successful contemporary practices that reverse that order between agency and autonomy, that embed themselves and devalorize their work so as to gain more agency.
Yeah, I asked that question because I feel like I have no great examples. The things that come to mind though are certainly like practice. I mean, I would imagine, so, well, here's two examples of things that seem like they're on their way there. So Jay Wickersham is a lawyer / architect that seems to be the lawyer for a ton of large firms out of Boston, but he wrote a nice piece on kind of the history of practice and at least 5 years ago now. Anyway, his suggestion was that the way mass design groups has set themselves up is one example of a successful practice in terms of finding agency. And he basically points out that like by creating part of the office that's a nonprofit and part of the office that is a for-profit practice, they can use that nonprofit side to structure their financial relation things to stuff differently. They can depend on looking for grants and other forms of financial support to carry stuff out that doesn't position them in a way that's entirely dependent on capital that's in the hand of someone else. So I think Mass Design Group might be one of the interesting examples. And I think he's their lawyer, so I assume he knows much more about how all that plays out, but that seems like a possibility. You know, the other thing is, and this is not realized, but Ann Liu, that's at University of Michigan now, her and her partner, I can't remember the name of the firm now, gosh. But for they were asked to do something, I think it was for the Chicago Biennial 2 years ago. They made the proposal of, actually, we don't need architects designing big stuff for Chicago. We need to form the Office of the Public Architect. And they basically did it by looking at, like, pulling up the maps of where all the building code violations are in Chicago. And you can map building code violations or assessments for building code violations onto income, and you can map it onto race. And the suggestion was, we actually need an Office of the Public Architect that would be there as a basically employee of the government that would go out and help people design their way out of these building code violations. So that seems like a publicly employed architects that fix the built environment seems like another super provocative answer to that. Of course, you need the political will to do that, which who knows what that's going to look like. But that seemed like another really promising or provocative idea, at least to me.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
I'll have to find it. They wrote a short little piece about it. It might have been in Log or something like that. I know there's a couple of short descriptions they put up about it, but I can share it.
Any other questions, comments? Brian, thank you. Barbara, Alexander, thank you. This was so fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sticking it out, everybody, and chatting.
It was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll feed you lunch next time, for real.
Sounds good.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you so
All right,
much.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
Bye.